The Lighthouse Keeper's Daughter. Chapter 1. The Storm. The sea had a long memory, and it did not forgive easily. Lieutenant Jasper Cole was learning this lesson with every heave of the deck beneath his feet. His Majesty's cutter, HMS Stormfinch, was a stout ship, built for the rough waters of the North Atlantic, but against the fury of an equinoctial gale, she was little more than a cork. For 36 hours, the storm had played with them, a grey-bearded giant swatting a toy. The wind, a physical force of malice, shrieked through the rigging, and the rain, driven horizontal, stung the skin like birdshot. Jasper, lashed to the wheelhouse frame, tasted salt and copper in his mouth. His orders were lost to the wind the moment they left his lips. He was a navigation officer, a man who dealt in certainties, stars, charts, compass bearings. There was no certainty here. Only the monstrous rolling mountains of water that rose from the blackness to engulf them. A wave, larger than the rest, a true leviathan, struck them broadside. The Stormfinch didn't just roll. She was lifted, twisted, and slammed down with a crack that Jasper felt in his bones. The sound of the mainmast snapping was a gunshot that signalled defeat. Men were shouting, the pumps were clanking a desperate rhythm, and the sea was pouring into the hold with a greedy, thunderous roar. "She's done, sir!" the boatswain, a grizzled man named Hitchins, roared in his ear. "We have to abandon." Jasper's mind, trained to assess and act, clicked into a cold, clear focus. He scanned the impossible dark. There was no horizon, no sky, only the howling, churning chaos. But then, for a fleeting second, a break in the clouds, a rent in the fabric of the storm, allowed a sliver of moonlight through, and in that instant he saw it. A flash, a single, rhythmic pulse of light on the horizon, impossibly distant, but there. A lighthouse. "There!" he yelled, pointing. "Make for it! The longboat!" It was a suicide mission, a skiff against a typhoon. But staying on the Stormfinch was a death sentence. With a handful of men, they fought the canvas-covered longboat, a battle of raw, terrified strength against the fury of the deep. They launched, and the sea swallowed them whole. For what felt like hours they rode, or rather, they were tumbled and tossed like dice in a cup. Men were lost to the darkness, their cries snatched away by the wind. Jasper, his hands raw and bleeding from the rope, focused on the light. It would appear, a faint, blinking eye in the murk, and then vanish. Flash. Pause. Flash. Flash. A pattern. He clung to it as if it were a lifeline thrown from heaven itself. Just as hope was beginning to curdle into despair, the sound changed. The furious crash of waves against open sea became a deeper, more violent thunder. The sound of water meeting stone. They were being driven toward cliffs. Through the spray and dark, Jasper saw them, jagged teeth of black rock gnashing at the foam. The longboat, with a final sickening lurch, was lifted high and hurled forward. Jasper felt himself flying through the air, a moment of terrifying weightlessness, before the world exploded into cold, dark silence. Consciousness returned to Jasper in fragments, the harsh, rhythmic rasp of his own breathing, the taste of blood and brine, the relentless pound of a headache behind his eyes. He was lying on his back, and the ground beneath him was not the shifting deck of a ship, but solid, unyielding rock. He was soaked to the bone, and every muscle in his body screamed in protest. Was finally abating, its winds reduced, too, was finally abating, its winds reduced to a sullen moan. Of the longboat and his crewmates, there was no sign. The sea, a churning cauldron of grey and white, had claimed them or spat them out elsewhere. He was alone. With a monumental effort he pushed himself up. The lighthouse. It had to be close. He remembered the light. He began to climb, scrambling over slick, treacherous boulders, his naval boots finding scant purchase. The cliff was not sheer, but a tumble of ancient rockfall, offering a path upward. He climbed for an eternity, it seemed, driven by a primal urge for shelter. And then he saw it. Perched on a more level plateau of the island, a squat, powerful tower of grey stone rose from the rock. It was not the elegant, whitewashed tower of storybooks. It was a brutalist sentinel streaked with salt and the scars of centuries of storms. Attached to its base was a low, sturdy cottage, its walls several feet thick, its windows shuttered tight against the weather. A thin plume of smoke, whipped horizontal by the wind, came from a stone chimney. Life. Warmth. He stumbled toward the heavy oak door of the cottage and, using the last of his strength, lifted the iron knocker and let it fall. The sound was dull and heavy, swallowed by the wind. He leaned against the doorframe, his eyes closing. He knocked again, a feeble, desperate thumping. He heard the scrape of a bolt, and the door swung inward. The sudden warmth and light from within was blinding. He saw a silhouette, slight of frame, backlit by the glow of a hearth. "Please," he croaked, his voice a stranger's. "Shipwrecked." There was a moment of stillness, and then the figure moved. A hand, surprisingly strong, grasped his arm and pulled him inside. The door slammed shut behind him, cutting off the howl of the wind and plunging him into a profound, blessed silence, broken only by the crackle of a fire and the steady, rhythmic ticking of a clock. As his eyes adjusted, the silhouette resolved into a young woman. She was perhaps in her mid-20s, with hair the colour of dark honey, pulled back from a face that was pale and serious. Her eyes, the colour of the sea on a calm day, were wide with concern as she assessed him. She wore a simple woolen dress and a thick knitted shawl. "Can you stand?" she asked, her voice low and steady, carrying a faint accent he couldn't quite place. He nodded, though his legs threatened to buckle. She guided him to a sturdy wooden chair pulled close to the roaring hearth. The heat was shocking, almost painful on his frozen skin. She knelt and began to work at the frozen knots of his boots. "I'm Bryn," she said, her focus on the task. "Bryn Tarrant. My father is the lighthouse keeper. We didn't think anyone could survive a night like that." "Jasper Cole, Lieutenant, Stormfinch." He winced as she pulled the boot free. "There were others." She looked up at him then, and the pity in her eyes was its own kind of wound. "The sea gives back what it chooses, Lieutenant. We'll look when the light is better. But for now, you're here." She turned to a large black kettle hanging over the fire and ladled steaming liquid into a pottery mug. "Drink this. It's just broth, rabbit and herbs." His hands shook so violently he could barely hold the mug. She wrapped her own hands around his, steadying them. The touch was simple, practical, yet it sent a current through him that had nothing to do with the fire's warmth. He drank, and the hot, savoury liquid was the most wonderful thing he had ever tasted. The door to the cottage opened again, letting in a gust of damp air. A tall, broad-shouldered man entered, his face weathered to the texture of old leather. He carried the smell of the sea and the storm on his oilskins. His keen blue eyes went immediately to the stranger by the fire. "Bryn?" His voice was a low rumble. "Shipwreck," Bryn explained, rising. "His name is Jasper Cole, Lieutenant. His vessel foundered. He's the only one." The man, Elias Tarrant, pulled off his dripping sou'wester and hung it on a peg. He studied Jasper with the quiet, assessing gaze of a man accustomed to reading the sea and the sky. He saw the fine wool of his uniform, now torn and ruined, the officer's bearing that even exhaustion couldn't fully erase, and the direct, if weary, look in his eyes. "You're alive," Elias said simply. "That's more than most can say who dance with that sea on a night like this. You're welcome to what we have, Lieutenant. It's not much, but it's dry." "Thank you," Jasper said, his voice thick with more than just gratitude. "I am in your debt." Elias grunted, moving to warm his own hands by the fire. "No debt on this rock, just survival. The storm's blown itself out, but the seas'll be mountains for days. You'll be our guest for a while." He looked at his daughter, a silent question in his eyes. She gave a tiny nod. Bryn turned to Jasper. "You need rest. You can have the spare room. It was my brother's. He's away at sea." A flicker of something, a shadow of old pain passed over her features, gone as quickly as it came. She helped him to a small, sparse room off the main living area. There was a narrow bed with a patchwork quilt, a washstand, and a small window that looked out onto the endless grey sea. He sank onto the bed, the world tilting around him. "Sleep," Bryn instructed, pulling a rough woolen blanket over him. "The light will be here when you wake." He wanted to thank her, to say something that conveyed the enormity of what her simple kindness meant. But the warmth, the safety, and the profound exhaustion were a tide too strong to fight. His eyes closed, and he fell into a deep, dreamless sleep, the sound of the dying storm and the steady, rhythmic blink of the lighthouse beam sweeping past his window, his only lullabies. Chapter 2. The Keepers. The days that followed took on a strange, timeless rhythm for Jasper. Rescued from the maw of the sea, he existed in a quiet purgatory between the life he had known and the future he couldn't yet see. The cottage and the lighthouse on their remote island, a speck of rock called Black Island on the charts, became his entire world. Elias Tarrant was a man of few words, but those he did speak were steeped in the wisdom of the deep. He had been keeper of this light for over 30 years, a solitary sentinel against the dark. His life was a ritual of duty, maintaining the giant Fresnel lens, trimming the wicks, ensuring the clockwork mechanism that revolved the light was wound, and logging the weather. He moved with the unhurried economy of a man who understood his place in the order of things. He was the calm at the center of the storm. Bryn was the light within the light. She managed the cottage with a quiet efficiency, transforming the sparse space into a warm and welcoming home. She cooked, she cleaned, she tended a small windswept vegetable patch that was a miracle of perseverance. But Jasper soon learned that her role extended far beyond the domestic. She was her father's shadow and his partner. She knew the inner workings of the lighthouse mechanism as well as he did. She could climb the spiraling stone stairs to the lamp room in her sleep, and she understood the language of the sea, the different textures of the waves, the messages in the flight of the seabirds, the stories told by the flotsam washed ashore. He watched her one afternoon as she stood at the cliff's edge, a spyglass held to her eye, scanning the horizon. The wind whipped strands of honey-coloured hair across her face, but she stood as still as the rock beneath her feet. She was searching for any sign of wreckage, any trace of his lost shipmates. He knew there would be none. The sea had taken them, and it would not give them back. "There's a cask," she said suddenly, lowering the glass and pointing. "Barrel, maybe, caught in the kelp bed by needlepoint. Might be supplies. Might be something we can use." She turned to him, her sea-grey eyes clear and practical. "Care to stretch your legs, Lieutenant? It's a fair scramble, but the work will do you good." It was the first time she had invited him to participate in the island's life. He had spent his first days simply recovering, sleeping, and eating her simple, nourishing food. The invitation felt like an honor. He nodded, pulling on the heavy woolen coat Elias had lent him. The walk to needlepoint was treacherous but breathtaking. Bryn moved over the wet rocks with the sure-footed grace of a seabird, pointing out the safest path, warning him of hidden cracks and slippery patches of seaweed. Jasper, a man used to the ordered decks of a naval vessel, felt clumsy and out of his element. Yet her patient guidance was never condescending. The barrel, when they reached it, was wedged in a cleft of rock, battered but intact. It was a supply cask from a merchant ship, they guessed, filled with salted pork. It was too heavy to carry back whole. As they worked to break the seal and salvage what they could, Jasper found himself talking. He told her about the Stormfinch, about his men, about the sickening moment the wave had struck. He told her about his family in Portsmouth, his mother's anxiety, his father's quiet pride in his naval career. He spoke more freely than he had with anyone in years. Bryn listened, her hands busy with the task, her silence an invitation to continue. When he finally fell quiet, she looked at him. "My brother, Kai," she said, her voice low. "He went to sea too, 5 years ago, a whaler. He wrote for a while, letters full of strange places and great leaping creatures. Then the letters stopped. The sea. It doesn't always give back what it takes." Jasper felt a profound pang of understanding. He saw, then, the source of her quiet strength. It was forged in the same crucible as his own naval discipline, but hers was born of loss and endurance, not orders and duty. The lighthouse was not just her home, it was her anchor. It was the thing that kept the darkness at bay, a promise of light in the face of the deep's eternal, consuming indifference. "I'm sorry," he said, the words utterly inadequate. She gave a small, tight smile. "I keep his room ready. It helps, somehow, to think he might just walk back in one day." She stood, brushing off her hands. "Come on, we should get this back before the gulls find it." That evening, as Elias wound the clockwork for the night, Bryn prepared a simple supper of the salvaged pork and potatoes. Jasper found himself watching her as she moved around the small kitchen. He noticed the way the firelight caught the glint in her hair, the concentration on her face as she sliced bread, the quiet competence in her every gesture. A feeling stirred in him, a warmth that had nothing to do with the fire. It was a feeling he had not allowed himself in years, a sense of being home. Later, Elias settled into his worn armchair with a book of shipping forecasts, and Bryn took up a piece of mending by the light of a paraffin lamp. The silence was not empty, but full of a shared, quiet companionship. Jasper, watching the lighthouse beam pulse its silent rhythm through the thick glass of the window, felt a profound peace settle over him. The storm that had wrecked his ship had also, it seemed, wrecked his old life. And in its place, on this barren rock, something new and fragile was beginning to take root. He noticed, then, the other lights, not the beam from the tower, but lights from the cottage window. They weren't just shining out to sea, they were facing inland, toward the distant, dark shape of the mainland coast. He'd seen Bryn light them earlier, 2 oil lamps placed on the window ledges of the room facing the shore. He'd thought nothing of it, a simple act of warding off the night. But now, in the quiet, he found it curious. Why light lamps that couldn't possibly help any ship at sea? He didn't ask. It was not his place. He was a guest, a survivor, a man with no right to pry into the quiet rituals of this family's life. But the image of those 2 lamps, burning steadily toward the shore, lodged in his mind like a splinter. Chapter 3. The Signals. A week passed, then 2. Jasper's strength returned fully, and with it came a gnawing restlessness. He was a man of action, used to purpose, and the idleness of his recovery began to chafe. He threw himself into helping with the lighthouse chores. He learned to polish the massive brass fittings of the lens until they gleamed, to trim the wicks with surgical precision, and to help Elias haul the heavy canisters of oil up the winding stairs. The physical labor was a balm, silencing the part of his mind that dwelled on the men he had lost. His relationship with Bryn deepened with each passing day. Their conversations, once hesitant and formal, now flowed with an easy intimacy. They walked the island's perimeter, collecting driftwood and seabird feathers. He told her about the stars, pointing out the constellations that had once guided his ship, and she taught him the names of the sea bloom in the rock pools, sea anemones like tiny, colourful flowers, and starfish clinging to the stone. He found himself watching for her in the mornings, the sound of her footsteps on the stone floor a welcome start to his day. Her quiet competence, her dry wit, and the hidden depths of sadness in her eyes captivated him. He had known women in the port cities, fleeting acquaintances in ballrooms and theatres. Bryn was something else entirely. She was as real and as raw as the island itself. In her presence, the polished veneer of the naval officer seemed to peel away, revealing a man he had forgotten he was. Simpler, more honest, more alive. One evening, Jasper was in the lamp room with Elias, helping him with the final checks before dusk. Through the huge glass panes, he had a panoramic view of the island and the darkening sea. His gaze drifted down to the cottage, and he saw Bryn emerge from the door. She walked to the edge of the cliff that faced the mainland, the very spot where she had first scanned for wreckage. In her hand, she carried a lantern. She didn't light it. She simply stood there, holding it, facing the distant coast. She remained motionless for a full minute, a solitary statue against the grey sky, before turning and walking back inside. A short while later, as darkness fully claimed the sky, he saw the two lamps go on in the cottage window, their light directed not at the churning sea, but at the silent shore. He couldn't contain his curiosity any longer. As they descended the stairs, he asked Elias, as casually as he could, "The lights in the cottage window, they face the mainland. Is that for something?" Elias stopped on the stairwell, his weathered face unreadable in the dim glow from the lamp room above. He was silent for a long moment, and Jasper felt a sudden chill, a sense that he had trespassed on something private. "It's an old habit," Elias said finally, his voice low. "From Bryn's mother. She was from the mainland, used to light a lamp for her people, a way of feeling connected across the water." He paused, his hand resting on the cold stone wall. "Bryn keeps the tradition." The explanation was simple, plausible, but Jasper sensed there was more. The image of Bryn standing at the cliff's edge with the unlit lantern, waiting, watching, felt less like a sentimental tradition and more like a vigil, a signal. The next day, while Elias was napping before his night watch, Jasper found Bryn in the vegetable patch, coaxing a few hardy cabbages from the stony soil. "Your father told me about the lamps," he said, kneeling beside her to help pull weeds. "About your mother." Bryn's hands stilled for a moment, a flicker of something, surprise, wariness, crossing her face before she nodded. She was a mainland girl, never truly took to the isolation. The lamps were her way of bridging the gap, I suppose. "It must be a lonely life," Jasper said softly, "for anyone not born to it." Bryn looked at him, her grey eyes direct. "It can be, but it's the only life I know. The lighthouse, it's in my blood. The light goes out, people die. That's a simple truth. It gives a purpose you don't find in many places." She looked back at the cabbage she was tending. "The lamps are just a reminder that we're here, and that out there someone might be thinking of us too." It was a beautiful sentiment, and Jasper wanted to believe it. But the naval officer in him, trained to observe, to question, to find patterns, could not let it go. The lamps were not just a reminder, they were a code. He had been schooled in signalling. He knew the difference between a general glow and a deliberate directional beam. Those lamps were positioned to be seen from a specific point on the mainland coast, and Bryn's vigil with the lantern wasn't a vague, sentimental gesture. It was a check, a confirmation. She was waiting for an answer. That night, he couldn't sleep. He lay in Kai's narrow bed, listening to the wind and the rhythmic pulse of the great light. He got up and moved to his small window, which faced the sea. From there, he couldn't see the cottage windows facing the shore, but he could see the beam from the lighthouse, sweeping its eternal protective circle. He thought of the men on the Stormfinch, men who might have been saved if they'd had a light like this to guide them. A sudden flash, faint and distant, caught his eye. It came from the direction of the mainland. It was not the steady beam of a lighthouse, but a single sharp blink of light. Then another, a pattern, short, long, short, the letter K in Morse code, a signal meaning I am ready to communicate. His blood ran cold. He watched, transfixed, as the signal was repeated once, twice, and then the darkness on the horizon was complete once more. He turned instinctively toward the cottage's interior, toward the windows facing the shore, and there he saw one of the lamps flicker. Just once. A single, answering blink. Jasper stood frozen by his window, his mind racing. Smuggling. It had to be. In a remote cove on the mainland, a boat could land unseen. They would need a signal, a warning that the coast was clear, that the revenue men were not about. And what better all clear than a light from a lighthouse? A place of official authority above suspicion. The lighthouse beam itself was too regular, too predictable. But those cottage windows, facing the shore, they were the perfect, private signal. He felt a wave of nausea wash over him. Bryn. Quiet, strong, kind Bryn. The woman who had saved his life, who had shared her grief, who made him feel more human than he had in years. She was part of a smuggling ring. Her father, the stoic, honourable keeper, was in on it, the brother away at sea. Was he away, or was he part of this too? But who would he report it to? He was a naval officer, a man bound by duty and the king's law. He was obligated to report this. But who would he report it to? He was stranded on this rock, at the mercy of these people. And more than that, he was falling in love with one of them. The next morning, he watched them with new eyes. Elias went about his duties with the same quiet diligence. Bryn served him breakfast with her usual gentle smile. But now Jasper saw the secrets beneath the surface. He saw the tension in Elias's shoulders, the way Bryn's eyes would drift, seemingly absently, toward the mainland window. The comfortable, peaceful world of the lighthouse had shattered, replaced by a stage where every glance, every word, felt like a performance. He knew he had to confront her. The truth was a chasm between them, and he could not build a bridge across it with lies. Chapter 4. The Beacon. He found her that afternoon in the lighthouse tower. She was in the lamp room, a soft cloth in her hand, polishing the great glass prisms of the Fresnel lens. The afternoon sun streamed through the windows, catching the cut crystal and throwing tiny rainbows across the curved walls. She looked like a figure in a cathedral, tending a sacred flame. He stood in the doorway, watching her. She sensed his presence and turned, a smile lighting her face. It faltered when she saw the expression in his eyes. "Jasper, what is it? You look like you've seen a ghost." He took a step into the room. Not a ghost, Bryn. A signal. He held her gaze. "Last night, from the mainland, a K in Morse, and one of your lamps answered." The colour drained from her face. The cloth slipped from her fingers and fell to the stone floor with a soft thud. She didn't pick it up. She just stared at him, her sea-grey eyes wide with a mixture of fear and... Was it relief? "You watch the shore," he continued, his voice low, heavy with a pain he hadn't anticipated. "You light the lamps, your vigil with the lantern. It's not for your mother, is it? It's a code, a signal for them." For a long, terrible moment, she was silent. The only sound was the distant cry of gulls and the low thrum of the wind against the thick glass. Then she spoke. Her voice was quiet, but steady. "Yes." The single word was a knife. Jasper flinched. "Why? Bryn, why? Your father is the keeper, a man of trust. This is treason. Smuggling. You could hang for this." "I know," she whispered. She turned away from him, looking out at the vast, indifferent sea. "You think we do it for money? For gold?" A bitter, broken laugh escaped her. "Look around you, Jasper. Look at this life. We are prisoners here, as surely as if we were in a jail. The Admiralty pays my father a pittance. We patch our clothes until they fall apart. We eat what the sea gives us and what we can wrestle from this stubborn soil. When When my brother was lost, we couldn't even afford to have a proper search made. He just vanished. She turned back to face him, and he saw tears streaming unchecked down her cheeks. The men on the mainland, they're not thieves, Jasper. They're fishermen. Their families are starving too. There are new taxes, unfair laws. They run a little brandy, a little tobacco, just to survive. We don't hurt anyone. We don't bring violence. We just give them a sign, a single quiet blink from our window to tell them the coast is clear of the revenue cutter. That's all. "So you are the lookout," he said, the accusation flat in his mouth. "The lighthouse keeper's daughter, a beacon for criminals." "We are a beacon for the desperate," she corrected him, her voice gaining strength. "We give them hope, a tiny light in the darkness, just like this tower gives to ships at sea. Is it so different? We save lives, Jasper. Maybe not from shipwreck, but from despair. From watching your children go hungry." She stepped closer to him, her eyes pleading. "I didn't plan to tell you. I hoped you would never see. But a part of me is glad you know. I am so tired of the lies. So tired." He stood there, caught between the iron law of his duty and the profound human truth of her words. He thought of his own privileged life in Portsmouth, his comfortable childhood. He had never known this kind of hunger, this kind of isolation. He had only known the abstract rules of the sea, the clear-cut lines of duty. Here, in the grey light of the lamp room, the lines were brutally blurred. "What happens now?" she asked, her voice small. "Will you turn us in?" He looked at her, this woman who had saved him, who had shared her grief and her home, who had taught him the names of sea bloom and the true meaning of strength. He saw the fear in her eyes, but he also saw a core of steel, a woman prepared to face the consequences of her choices. And he knew, with a certainty that shook him to his core, that his duty was no longer to a distant admiralty, but to this woman, to this island, to this new and fragile truth he had found. He reached out and took her hand. It was cold, but her fingers curled around his. "I see a woman who saved my life," he said, his voice thick. "I see a family doing what they must to survive in a world that has forgotten them. I see a light I don't want to live without." A sob escaped her, a sound of pure release. She swayed toward him, and he pulled her into his arms. He held her tight, her head against his chest, the scent of salt and clean wool in his hair. The great lens of the lighthouse revolved silently behind them, casting its long, protective beams across the sea, indifferent to the small, human drama unfolding in its shadow. That night, Jasper took his place at the cottage window. When the single, questioning blink came from the mainland, he was ready. He didn't look at Bryn, who stood behind him, her hand resting on his arm. He simply reached for the lamp and, with a steady hand, gave the single, answering flicker. The signal was given. The coast was clear. In the weeks that followed, Jasper became a part of the secret. He learned the pattern of the signals, the rhythm of the illicit trade. He never saw the smugglers. He only saw their distant lights. And he found he felt no guilt, no conflict. He had found a new duty, a new purpose. He was protecting a different kind of treasure. One evening, as autumn began to paint the island in shades of gold and rust, he and Bryn stood on the cliff's edge, watching the sun sink into the sea, a fiery ball melting into the horizon. The air was cool and clean. "I've sent word to the Admiralty," he said quietly. "Through a fishing boat we trust. I've reported that I'm recovered, but that I've taken a temporary post as assistant keeper here. They've agreed for now. The Navy has many officers, but this lighthouse, it only has one family." Bryn looked at him, her eyes shining. "You're staying." My dear and gentle listeners, thus concludes our tale for tonight. If you have walked these winding paths of devotion and doubt with us, if you have felt the hush of candlelit confessions and the tremor of guarded hearts at last laid bare, then you have my most sincere gratitude. It is no small thing to lend one's time and tender attention to a story. In an age as hurried as our own, such constancy is a rare and admirable virtue. I thank you for it most warmly. Should you wish to remain in our company, to wander further through moonlit gardens, stand witness to proud dukes undone, steadfast heroines revealed, and love that triumphs over pride and peril alike, I entreat you to subscribe and join our growing circle. By subscribing, you ensure that no whispered scandal, no long-buried secret, and no long-awaited